Daria, shall I go?
Yep. Whenever you're ready, Gilbert.
All right, thanks. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Crockpot Seminar Series. My name is Topher McDougall, and along with Daria Tomsky, we sort of jointly, and mostly Daria, stewards and curates this series. So it's, as she has already mentioned, it has grown a lot. So thanks for moving over across the hall into the larger room. Sorry I can't be there with you today. It's a real pleasure to introduce my colleague here, Professor Dustin Sharp. Dustin is a human rights lawyer with a JD from Harvard Law School, a PhD from Leiden University. He is, I think, widely recognized as one of the leading scholars in the field of transitional justice. Before entering academia, he spent years on the front lines of human rights work as a researcher with Human Rights Watch in West Africa, documenting abuses and advocating for accountability. He now serves as the Associate Dean of the Kroc School and the Interim Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. He's also just a wonderful human, and I'm privileged to have him as a friend and colleague. His paper today comes at a moment of real consequence, I think, when authoritarianism is resurgent. Freedom of speech and academic inquiry are under pressure. Universities themselves are being coerced and politicized, as we've sort of been seeing in the news, in ways that test our collective integrity. War is resurgent. Colonialism is in many ways resurgent. In that context, I think that Dustin's argument, about which we'll hear, about how we might rethink and reform and redesign the institutions that we've constructed to uphold this sort of ever-expanding pantheon of enshrined rights, feels really urgent and relevant. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dustin Sharp.
Everyone for being here today. We had a lot of people show up for the last Crockpot. It was a psychedelics paper, so I think I've cracked the Crockpot algorithm, which is drugs and then fears, right? So fear is sticky in the attention economy. So this talk is based on a paper called The Case for Human Rights, Realism, and Restraint in the New Era, came out recently in the Journal of Human Rights. And it's open access, so you can Google it and you can download the PDF if you need a sleep aid for the evening. But what I want to do tonight this morning is walk us through a story. So the way I scheduled the PowerPoint, I did a story in 4 acts. So Act 1 looks at this kind of euphoric moment right at the end of the Cold War. So it seemed like democracy and human rights were marching forward inevitably. Act 2 is the kind of letdown as conflict returned and authoritarianism reasserted itself. Act 3 is the sort of twist in the plot, or sort of paradox, where the world gets darker, even as we have more human rights laws and institutions than any time in history. So how do we actually kind of make sense of that? And Act 4 is the part where I try to sketch out a more sustainable path forward, one that emphasizes realism and restraint, and what I call and will try to define for you as liberal localism. I don't think I would say it's a story of triumph, but I also don't think it's a story of despair in the way you might expect coming to a talk like this. I think it's a story about illusions. It's a story about limits, and it's a story about how human rights might adapt to endure. So Mark Twain is said to have quipped, "Prediction is difficult, especially about the future." And I think that's a really good starting point for a conversation like this, because when we look back, when you look at the predictions people made about the future, they probably tend to tell us more about their own hopes and fears than what actually came next. So some of those visions in the 20th century were utopian, and the visions of flying cars, robots that were going to be serving us cocktails, the steady march of progress, and other visions of the future were quite dystopian. They were Orwell's vision of a boot stamping on the human face forever, nicer quotes, or nuclear annihilation wiping us out. And of course, those things could still happen, and I'm still waiting for my flying car. But the truth has always been a little bit more complicated. We didn't get flying cars, but we live with technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to people at the time. And even today, when you think about some of them like AI. And the Orwellian dystopia didn't exactly arrive in that form, at least at the scale envisioned in the book. but the surveillance powers of states and corporations today would have been the envy of Big Brother. So that would have been hard to imagine. So when we think about the future, humility is a useful starting point, useful stance, because the future rarely cooperates with our expectations. And that's as true of human rights as it is for anything else. So, when I gesture at predictions about the future of human rights, I'm definitely mindful that the future makes fools of us all, including me. So Act One begins in the early 1990s, and this was that kind of heady moment at the end of the Cold War where human rights seemed to be everywhere. As many of you weren't born, but they were everywhere. Democracy was expanding, transitional justice processes were multiplying, the United Nations was busier than ever, and globalization seemed to carry everything forward with it. So this was an era that Louis Henkin called the Age of Rights, which he called the idea of our time. Catherine King described what she called the just cascade, which seemed to be unfolding in real time. Francis Fukuyama went so far as to declare the end of history to be upon us. And writing in 1999, just as Prince told us that we should all be partying, we had David Reed writing in the New York Times talking about the triumph of human rights, even while acknowledging that it was a precarious one, according to Reef. And perhaps it was that note of precarity that was especially prescient. But looking back, it was a moment, it's the feeling, it was a moment of extraordinary confidence. Human rights didn't just seem possible, they seemed inevitable. And it seemed like the tide of history was truly with them. So here's Fukuyama in 1989, when he said, what we're witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, but the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. If you go back and actually read his article and then the book that the article turned into, his argument was actually a lot more nuanced than people remember. And people forget that the original article was the end of history with a question mark. And if any of you have published books, or if we ever do, one of the things you'll learn, which is a surprise to me, the authors don't get to choose the title. And so the publisher stripped it of the question mark. Anyway, so it was more thoughtful. But the point remains that that quote and the meme that's become the end of history, certainly captured the mood of that era. This assumption that democracy and rights were the natural endpoint of history. Models of governance that were different than that would somehow wither away. And it was really not a question of if that would happen, it was just a question of how long would it actually take. And hindsight is, of course, always 2020, but in hindsight, the hubris is quite obvious. Now, I'm not saying that the good times for human rights, I'm not sure when those were, but this slice of history, if those were the good times for human rights, that they were ever really that good. Post-Cold War moment was full of human rights disasters. I think of that as that narrow slice of history between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Twin Towers. I'm not sure exactly how we date it. But the toehold of human rights law in global affairs was always tenuous, was always precarious. I think what's different compared to then is that we've lost a shared sense that the expanding circle of democracy and human rights is some kind of inevitable historical force that is destined to be this way. And we've lost a lot of confidence. We lost confidence in the Human Rights Project. We've lost confidence in the Democratic Project, or confidence in the larger liberal project. And I think that lack of confidence matters a lot more than we realize. I was really that confidence was like the steroids that pushed some of these policies forward in the early 90s. So there were certainly amazing things that happened during this post-Cold War moment. Samuel Huntington talked about a third wave of democratization where we had 60 countries. That's a lot, right? 60 countries went through some process of democratization, right? So you can go back to right after World War II, and there's something like, what is around 10 democracies in the world. So it's a huge expansion to see that third wave of democratization. The United Nations Security Council, which is essentially like frozen on ice, it kind of lay dormant for most of the Cold War, passed very few resolutions because of the deadlock between the USSR and the USA. It came alive, it got thought out, and it actually started to do something. It took a more activist and interventionist stance in conflicts around the globe. International tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, which were the first international tribunals since Nuremberg. And we had the birth of the International Criminal Court in 2002. All that certainly felt auspicious to people at the time, including me, even if their execution would ultimately lead to disappointment. And so looking back, it's clear that the optimism of the 1990s collided with just the inevitable realities of the world we actually live in. It's not the kind of hopes that we projected into the future at the time. So instead of the end of history, we got its return. Autocracy proved resilient. Conflict has returned in force. democracy did not continue to expand, or it did for a time, but it's been receding. And so the data over the next few slides is going to illustrate this: declining scores for democracy, rising numbers of conflicts, growing casualty numbers, curtailment of peacekeeping missions. And together they tell the story of a less auspicious terrain for human rights. The biggest correlates for human rights, actually, I mean, these are kind of obvious, but democracy and peace, and then to some extent, economic equality. So the first graph is Freedom House's data, where they do their Freedom in the World report. Written chapters for them a couple of times, so I've kind of seen how the scoring process works. But the Freedom House data shows 18 consecutive years of democratic recession, at least for the free countries, moving us back to where things were in the kind of mid to late 90s. So that's about 2 decades of decline. Number of free countries has been shrinking. Partly free and free have held steady, or they've in some cases grown. And so you can look at these graphs in different ways. On the one hand, the number of free countries is still far, far higher than the historical norm, way, way better than it was at the end of World War II, right, or during the Cold War. On the other hand, the 2-decade decline in Freedom House's scores suggests that history is not a one-way ratchet. It's not just that things get better and then the ratchet can never go backwards. Those gains aren't locked in. Gains can be lost. And we know from history that gains can be lost at a breathtaking pace. Ask anyone who lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914, which in many ways was the pinnacle of European civilization at the time in terms of scientific and cultural achievements, and was hell on earth for decades after that, right? So no idea sometimes when the storm's about to hit. But I think it's increasingly clear that liberal democracy is fragile, it's contingent, and it's dependent upon specific conditions for its flourishing. And that was really not the view. That was the view in the early democratization literature. But then we have this post-Cold War moment where we sort of imagine anyone could have democracy, you just kind of had to have elections. And there you go. It turns out that democracy is probably more like a hothouse plant that survives under specific conditions than some kind of hardy perennial that can take root anywhere, anytime, irrespective of those scope conditions. So here are the trend lines for deaths in armed conflicts. So the number of conflicts have been rising, deaths in armed conflicts have been rising. So from Ukraine to Gaza, Syria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Yemen, conflict has returned. I mean, it never went away. Conflict has been escalating, sometimes at scale. And of course, each war brings with it mass displacement, humanitarian crises, catastrophic human rights outcomes. Nothing is worse for human rights than war, and it should be obvious. And conflicts don't tend to stay confined. They spill over porous borders, they generate refugee crises, they push politics in receiving conflicts in illiberal directions, as we've seen in Europe, and I would not be surprised if countries just start to pull out of the 1954 Refugee Convention at some point. Might actually be more honest in some ways. On the other hand, it's also worth noting that on a per capita basis, the level of violent death is still far below other periods in history, right? So the sky, it's getting worse. It's not that the sky is falling. Per person war death rates are historically were far higher, not just in the 2 world wars. That's kind of obvious with the spike you see on the one graph. But even in many pre-state and small-scale societies where anthropologists have tried to estimate the lifetime risk of dying violently, they were substantial. When you look at skeletal remains, it's hard to translate those skeletons into annual rates. But the broad point that's agreed on is that violence probably consumed a much larger number of lives in most periods of human history than it does today. Nasty Brutus, in short, we all know that quote. There's an element of truth to it when you look at death rates in hunter-gatherer societies. So, the trend today is moving in the wrong direction, but we should also keep a sense of proportion about just how bloody most of human history actually was. So one of the symbols of international resolve in the 1990s was UN peacekeeping. We saw this great fluorescence of peacekeeping, but then what became peace-building missions over the course of the post-Cold War era. It's true that many of those missions, if not most of them, were overstretched. They were underfunded. Many of them were ineffectual. But as much as critics like to complain about what was been called liberal international peacebuilding, and I think about half of the scholarly economy in different institutions in the UK for periods of time was based on critical scholarship of liberal international peacebuilding, publishing the same article 20 years in a row. Liberal international peacebuilding may be better than some of the alternatives, and probably certainly better than doing nothing. So in places like Syria and Yemen, the UN has proved largely impotent as conflicts have dragged on and have told us sword. And I think it might be kind of nice to have a little bit of liberal international peacebuilding in those countries, right? Or certainly would have certain points of those conflicts. So if I had to guess, it would probably be that conflict management in the new era is going to look much more like the minimalist peacekeeping of the Cold War era than the comparatively robust liberal international peace building of the post-Cold War era. So in addition to all these trend lines I'm talking about, it's important to note that we're living through tectonic shifts in world politics. So the unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War is giving, or has already given way to an era of multipolarity, rising great power competition. Historically, those periods are not good periods for peace and conflict. And so it's bringing with it greater instability. So there's not clear sides, but on one side, we can imagine, you have to imagine there's a liberal access of power, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea. And these are regimes that are actively hostile to human rights and which collaborate to evade sanctions and to help each other perpetuate human rights violations. And they are unlikely to move towards liberal democracy anytime soon, although surprises would certainly be welcome. But we can go back to the 1990s, and the assumption seemed to be that as China got more wealthy, it would inevitably democratize. And that clearly didn't prove to be the case, right? And even within established democracies, internationalism, multilateralism are losing ground. So they have been displaced by resurgent nationalism and isolationism. So in short, the geopolitical plates are shifting beneath our feet, and the landscape for human rights is becoming more fractured and unstable. So up until now, the story has been a fairly straightforward one. It's kind of a story of optimism that's then followed by some worrisome declines. But Act 3 introduces a kind of twist or a paradox, because even as democracy has been receding and conflict has been intensifying, the machinery of human rights has been expanding at an extraordinary pace. So we have more treaties, we have more institutions, more monitoring bodies, more special rapporteurs, more procedures, more declarations than at any time in human history, at least that we know of. Maybe on Atlantis or something before, but on paper, human rights have never been stronger. In practice, the indicators are often not moving in the right direction. And that's what I want to highlight in Act 3 here. So this chart shows the growth of international human rights machinery since the 1950s. So growth in the number of treaties, growth in the number of special procedures or special rapporteurs or human rights experts, I guess in non-UN speak, growth in the number of treaty bodies. So just about every decade has added more layers, more commissions, more councils, more rapporteurs, more special procedures. The architecture of human rights has expanded dramatically. And there is value in this, right? But there's also a risk. And there's a risk that we confuse institutional proliferation, that we confuse rights proliferation with real progress in people's lives. And I think it's worth asking whether we've reached a point where the machinery is growing more elaborate without becoming more effective. So as you might expect, as the number of human rights treaties has grown, so too has the number of rights that are articulated within the treaties. So the 9 core international human rights conventions contain not just dozens, but hundreds of distinct rights provisions. And there are some real challenges in trying to count up how many rights are actually in the 9 treaties. Not every article that's listed out actually has a right in it. Some are just kind of procedural things. Others pack multiple guarantees into a single article. And then, of course, there's redundancy as between the treaties. Multiple treaties prohibit torture, for example. And so Eric Posner, in his book, The Twilight of Human Rights, argued that there's many as 400 internationally guaranteed rights. I don't know how he gets at that number. I think he's just adding up the number of articles in all the treaties. I think that's a rather generous count, and that kind of served his argument. A more conservative estimate would be, if you parse them more carefully, it's probably something like 200 distinct rights in the treaties. We could probably be more conservative and whittle that down a bit, but we would still, the bigger picture wouldn't actually change, which is that the catalog of international human, the category of enumerated internationally protected rights has expanded dramatically from the relatively lean list that was expressed in the Universal Declaration in 1948 to the sprawling, elaborate edifice treaty-based rights that we have today. So if we went back to 1948 with just the Universal Declaration, those 30 articles that were adopted, we could probably count between 45 and 50 rights, depending on how you parse the multiple rights embedded within different articles. So any way you look at it, there's some serious rights proliferation. Another angle, the cumulative ratifications of the 9 core international human rights treaties. So that picture is also impressive because it gives a picture of almost near universal ratification of those core treaties. But it also raises a question, right? Because even states with appalling human rights records have signed these treaties, and sometimes all of the treaties. It's hard to avoid the impression that ratification has become almost cost-free. So signing is easy, compliance is not easy, right? Compliance is another matter. So again, we see this kind of paradox, more rights on paper, more treaties ratified, but not necessarily better human rights outcomes in practice. So Act 4 is the argument for realism and restraint. So the paradox we've just seen, the yawning gap between the law on the books and the law in action, suggests that more is not always better. But I also think that just besides the question of efficiency or effectiveness, there are other costs to expansionism that are important to explore. So one of the costs of rights expansion is that it conflates two very distinctive projects. I think it conflates a constitutional Bill of Rights type project and a broader legislative project. So when you look at the way constitutions work, they tend to have a smaller list of enumerated rights, and those rights are almost by definition counter-majoritarian. Right? So in the Federalist Papers, rights were seen necessary to protect, quote, insular minorities from the tyranny of the majority. Right? So they're there precisely to keep the majority from getting its way. Right? So there's some tension between the rights project and a majoritarian democratic project. The legislative agenda, by contrast, is usually much broader, right? And it comes with the stamp of democratic approval that is worked out through domestic politics. And it's not in tension with democracy because it's what, well, in theory, it's what the majority wills, right? What actually happens is a different story. But when the international system piles on ever more ambitious rights, it often bypasses that democratic process. And what emerges is a kind of legislation without a legislature, drafted by experts in New York and Geneva, not hammered out through debate and consent at home. So I would say the Universal Declaration struck a comparatively modest balance. It set a floor for decency without trying to define the good life for all peoples all over the world. But later treaties drift into fairly technocratic detail, declaring rights to disaggregated statistics, the right to be portrayed by the media in a particular light, even a right to nutrition, education. And these are great policies. I would vote for them. But do we really want to say that human beings are born with a fundamental, inalienable right to be portrayed in a certain way on television? And when we treat rights like a Jenga tower, which all the new blocks are kind of stacked on top of each other endlessly, right, the result is strain to notions of universality, to legitimacy, and maybe right, the tower is falling down. So rather than anchoring the core of human dignity, expansion risks colonizing the space for democratic self-rule, and in the process might weaken the very foundations on which rights depend, which is democracy. Which brings me to the second cost. So the second cost of human rights expansionism is that it risks crowding out pluralism and self-determination. So minimalist rights, right, if you just take something like the Universal Declaration, are often dismissed as being too modest, right? Just a quote, liberalism of fear. I think that's Samuel Moyne, that only polices the worst abuses, the worst forms of misrule. But when advocates respond by expanding the empire of rights into ever more domains, the project starts to look hegemonic, starts to look like a one-size-fits-all solution that suggests that there's only one way to be free. So there's a tension here that puts us in a bind because if the rights project is too minimalist, then rights look somehow powerless to beat back the tide of injustice. They look like some kind of just neoliberal thin veneer of rights. But if rights are too maximalist, they start to seem neo-colonial. And the human capacity for self-contradiction is probably infinite, but I mean, it's often the same people saying rights aren't doing enough. We're also saying, yes, but rights are neo-colonial and hegemonic, right? We need more rights. But which is it, right? There's a tension there that needs to be grappled with to a greater extent. So I do think there's another way, right? A more restrained vision of international human rights that provide the safety net of basic security while leaving space for societies to build upon those, on that foundation, stories of freedom on top of that foundation. Right? So from this perspective, the minimalism of the Universal Declaration is not a bug, it's actually a feature. Right? That's a selling point of the Declaration. The third problem with rights expansionism is that the system has simply become unworkable. So today there are hundreds of treaty rights, there are countless, there are thousands of soft law pronouncements and resolutions, and a dense web of monitoring bodies, rapporteurs, reporting procedures. But for all of that machinery, the gap between the law on the books and the law in action is enormous. I mean, just read the newspaper any single day. Many governments struggle to file even the most basic treaty compliance reports, and there's no penalty for not doing so. In many countries, treaty ratification has virtually no relationship to the actual state practice. And even where there is good faith on the part of governments, which is we certainly can't assume in many cases, the provisions in the treaties are often drafted so vaguely that it's hard to even know what compliance would look like. right? So telling states to modify certain cultural patterns or to ensure that everyone enjoys the benefits of scientific progress. All of that makes for a noble aspiration, but doesn't provide much in the way of practical guidance. And especially in countries I've worked in where the Ministry of Justice doesn't even have gas for the 2 cars in its motor pool. It's hard to imagine what they actually do with the 400 rights they're supposed to implement. But without robust domestic implementation and robust domestic institutions to translate these norms into binding domestic rules, much of international human rights law drifts into the realm of legal fiction. And I think the result is a system that expends enormous energy without delivering commensurate results. Enforcement is weak, monitoring is politicized, and legitimacy suffers. And I think at best, this creates a sort of cynicism. At worst, the system risks becoming a sort of zombie, which is still moving, kind of still doing a zombie thing, issuing declarations from Geneva, 38% of them against Israel every single year. It's a team sport, but with little impact on those who are actually most in need, right? And so the hard truth is that more is not always better. We just do a thought experiment, right? With doubling the number of rights to 400 or whatever we want to count it as, with doubling the number of rapporteurs that we have today, with doubling the number of condemnatory resolutions coming from Geneva, would that double justice? I mean, it's hard to even it's hard to even imagine a scenario where that's plausible, right? I think it would just actually dilute attention. And so I think a realistic path forward requires restraint, requires sequencing, requires priority setting, and the recognition that not all good things multiplied without limit turn into something better. Sometimes that can just collapse under its own weight. So taken together, these costs suggest something more than just the inefficiency of the system. They point to a system that is overextended, a system that is fragile, a system that is at risk of maybe already has discredited itself. And I think that's where realism comes in, that's where restraint comes in. So as I'm not quoting the definition of the paper, but this is a longer section. But by realism, I essentially mean a sober reckoning with the world as it is, which is a world where democracy is in retreat, democracy is advancing, and the resources for enforcement are limited, not just internationally, but domestically. By restraint, I mean a willingness to focus international law on a modest but vital floor, by protecting the core conditions of human dignity, rather than trying to legislate a perfect vision of justice from Geneva. And so what would that actually look like in practice? I think at a minimum, it means setting priorities. It means sequencing reforms, which is not really okay under the treaties, except for economic and social rights. It means resisting the temptation to treat every desirable policy as a new universal right that we somehow need to articulate, but they haven't stopped, right? This is still going on. At maximum, it could mean something bolder, something like a universal treaty on human rights that would distill the Universal Declaration into a binding instrument and then would supersede the 9 core international human rights treaties. And such a treaty would reduce the system's sheer volume while preserving its foundation. And whether or not we go that far, I don't think there's much appetite for that. I think one point is clear, that if human rights are going to survive in the new era and retain legitimacy, 2 different things, we will need to curb the enthusiasm behind the expansionist impulse and embrace a leaner and more grounded vision, one that is both realistic in its ambitions and restrained in its scope. But if you were to look at much of the scholarly and policy community right now, people are still partying like it's 1999. Right? There's still like ever more like nuanced forms of rights that we can articulate, more and more special rapporteurs for rights nobody's ever heard of. So having laid out why expansionism is problematic, I want to turn to the constructive counterpoint, which is what I call liberal localism. So whatever its flaws, the liberal tradition at the heart of modern human rights insists on a thing we could call civic respect. And that, if you want to unpack it, this is Edmund Fawcett. It involves the intrinsic worth of each person as a person. It involves limits on how majorities can treat minorities. It involves law-backed respect for individual projects, and it involves a tolerance for dissent. That is part of the inheritance, that liberal tradition that gave us international human rights, as most of us have the luxury of taking them for granted. But the ideology of liberalism today is embattled. It is criticized as being too minimal, too individualistic, too capitalistic, too arrogant, too Western, too X, too Y, too Z. Many have even declared that we now live in a post-liberal world. So, kind of RIP. But to the critics of liberalism, and I would agree with many of their critiques, but I would also say, compared to what? Liberalism is problematic compared to what? What are the actual alternatives? Catholic integralism, You can go read Adrian Vermeule's stuff, law professor at Harvard, who makes a straight-based argument that he basically thinks the US should be run as a theocracy by the Catholic Church. And there's a whole community. They have conferences, the Catholic Integralists. Political Islam, authoritarianism, socialism / communism, these are all alternative ideologies to liberalism. None of them exactly inspire confidence when it comes to pluralism, prosperity, and civic respect. It doesn't mean liberalism is a utopia. It offers a vision of incremental progress, managed conflict, tolerance of difference. These aren't very stirring things. These don't rouse people in the way that the revolutionary visions of solidarity and salvation, either for religion or socialism, the competing ideologies for liberalism, they talk a good talk. I understand the rhetorical appeal. But history suggests, and actually the present suggests, that liberalism works better than its rivals. The happiest people on the planet, if you look at the surveys, the freest people in the world are people living in liberal societies. Migrants every day around the world are risking life and limb to get to liberal societies, the places the rest of us are complaining about, right? So liberalism can feel uninspiring, it can feel vacuous. I would say that's the price of freedom. It gives space to individuals and communities to build their own meaning and not to have a meaning imposed upon them. Having grown up in a high demand religion, there is something comforting, right, about having Catholicism or Marxism or Islamicism, political Islamism, like imposed upon you, right? It gives you a framework for understanding the world. One doesn't have to search for meaning. Liberalism doesn't do that for you, right? It says find your own meaning, right? But that can leads to kind of an existential crisis and crisis of meaning that we have today. I think critics often conflate liberalism with neoliberal excess. You know, for a lot of students, when you grow up, you don't even know what is the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism. They're just kind of one thing. So atomized individualism, bare knuckle capitalism, arrogance masquerading as universality, right? Those could be neoliberal tendencies. But the liberal tradition is a big tent, it's several centuries old, and there's a lot of people said a lot of things, have written a lot of things. There are strands of liberal tradition that value pluralism, that value self-determination, that value subsidiarity, that value local agency. Those are not illiberal values. Those are liberal values, which brings me back to this concept of liberal localism. So the early Cold War gave us this overly confident, hegemonic liberal internationalism, which was sort of aggressive neoliberal internationalism. And that was a project that imagined that human rights democratization could somehow be globalized from the top down, often alongside disastrous interventions in places like Iraq. You could think of liberal localism as the chastened counterpoint to liberal internationalism. It argues that liberal ends must be pursued through liberal means. And that means modesty at the international level. That means a level of respect for sovereignty and pluralism, and a recognition that not all societies can or should tackle the same issues in the same way at the same time. It's not the same thing as abandoning rights. Liberal localism suggests a sturdy floor, democracy, the rule of law, basic core human rights. But beyond that floor, it leaves space for nations, for communities to fill their own horizon of justice according to their particular histories and cultures. So a universal treaty on human rights could, in theory, distill and bind that minimum floor. But above it, society should be free to experiment, to aspire, to build. To borrow a phrase from Sam Harris, one can imagine a moral landscape. It's always going to have peaks and valleys in it, but it might be possible to achieve different peaks of human thriving and minimization of human suffering that don't look exactly like Western world democracy. We still don't know what they would look like because we haven't seen them, right? So liberal localism is not the end of human rights. It's not a retreat into easy relativism. It's thought of as a middle way. Realism and restraint as applied to liberal internationalism. So you could think of it as a chastened but confident liberalism, one that acknowledges the limits of global expansionism while trusting plural societies can pursue human flourishing on their own terms. Liberal localism also means recognizing that different societies move at different speeds and different ways on contested social issues. And so the assumption that progress in one place can be transplanted wholesale to another place is just historically, but also presently naive. There's many issues we could think about. I mean, take immigration, right? So Japan and Canada are both prosperous democracies that are relatively human rights compliant compared to some others. One has chosen cultural homogeneity. The other has chosen multiculturalism. Each reflects its own history and preferences. Liberal localism would say that international law doesn't dictate a single model. What it can insist upon is a floor, dignity, and non-cruelty for those who cross a border or reside within one. But this kind of progressive view in the United States or Europe that human rights somehow requires virtually open borders, and anything less than that is tantamount to racism, is just not viable. It has produced serious backlash, right? It's the world we're experiencing. It's the failure of elites to actually pay attention to preferences here, democracy. None of this means that liberal localism is a cure-all. Some societies will use that space to thrive, and others will not. Again, the moral landscape is always going to have peaks and valleys. We have valleys today. Authoritarian regimes will persist, rights abuses will remain rampant in certain places, and liberal localism is certainly not going to prevent that. But the hard truth is that even under today's expansive human rights regime, we still have North Korea, and we still have many others that I could list out. So expansionism hasn't eliminated them, and realism suggests that it never will. But what liberal localism does offer is it's not perfection, but a more sustainable way of protecting human rights where they can be realistically take root while preserving their legitimacy in the long run. So it tries to pull us back from this increasing elaborate edifice of hard and soft law norms that is simply detached from the social and political realities of many countries. Final slide. So ultimately what I'm calling for is a bit of modesty. Modesty when it comes to the Human Rights Project and what its aspirations can reasonably assume to be. Modesty about the project of democracy, and modesty about the larger ideology of liberalism and its prospects for spreading. So it's not modesty in the sense of giving up on human rights, but modesty in how we imagine human rights. Right? So not imagining that an inevitable arc of history or something that it's been hard fought for and will always have to be hard fought for. Not human rights as a one-size-fits-all blueprint, but as a more grounded project. Right? So a floor for human dignity, a tool for mitigating suffering, a framework that leaves room for local agency and plural visions of the good life. Human rights are not the horizon of emancipation. They were never intended to be. They were just protecting us from the worst of the worst. They are an indispensable part of the foundation that makes free and open societies possible. And if there's some other way of getting to free and open societies, we haven't seen it yet. I also don't think the case for realism and restraint is pessimism. There's a whole literature of human rights pessimism with Hopgood's book on the end times of human rights and Posner's book on the twilight of human rights. I think it's not about abandoning rights, it's about protecting them by preserving their legitimacy going forward. And in a turbulent multipolar world, the Human Rights Project can't afford illusions of inevitability. Sitting on our laurels is a good way to get surprised. But if we do temper ambition with humility and balance universality with pluralism, rooting rights in local soil, then human rights can still play a vital role in helping societies navigate the uncertainty ahead. And so in the end, that's what I mean by realism and restraint. So I will conclude there and see if we have any questions.
Thank you. Very, very compelling argument. I had a question. The question is going to be, I'll tell you, so is where are these 200?
Multi-part question you're setting up for?
I'm saying like, this is the question, and this is like why I'm at. If I ask you the question, I give you time to think about the answer. You probably know it right now. But I'm wondering, like that list of 200 rights, I didn't know how to gotten that big. I'm wondering where they came from. And so like, is it a UN rapporteur, is it a UN office, someone in UN is doing it, or is it coming from grassroots? And like from local communities, are they asking for these things and it's getting upstream to the UN? And I ask that because I'm wondering if the vernacularization of human rights has just sort of actually created an atmosphere where people are like, oh yeah, I want this right, I want that right. And that is sort of a reflective of a democratic thrust that like people do want democracy and they're like, I want this thing and I want that thing. And it's a mess, but it shows in some ways maybe a success of the project in a way that people are even asking for those. Mm. Or is it somebody like in an office just being like, and we're just creating a list?
I think it's the story for each treaty is case by case, right? So the story of the UDHR is long and told. The story of the later treaties. I mean, we could take the Convention Against Torture, which in many ways was the product of Amnesty International. They got the Nobel Prize for it. In the 70s, they teamed up with some northern states, not surprisingly, and a few others. And those states were willing to introduce a declaration on torture, led to a push in the UN Convention Against Torture. We have things like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I think by pretty much any reckoning is an NGO product. It was NGOs that decided we wanted that and pushed for it, and we managed to push that through the UN. I wouldn't confuse NGO product with a kind of popular democratic sentiment in most countries. I mean, NGOs tend to be a phone-wielding elite in most countries. I mean, the elite of the elite in many countries. So I don't think that the number of rights is arisen based on an evolution in popular sentiment. I actually think that as the number of rights has grown, the gap between where the kind of democratic consensus is in most societies and what the rights say have actually only widened.
It's more elite, it's more coming from the elites,
Yeah,
rights.
yeah. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean if you go in a country, if you survey people on certain rights, that they wouldn't support certain rights.
Yeah.
But they're certainly not coming about as a result of a groundswell of support through the democratic process. Steve?
I look back at your floor of rights. And my experience, I worked at the World Bank because I was in human development with multilateral relations. I had to deal with all these rights. What I found interesting was to deal with the ILO, because the core labor standards of the ILO were not defined as human rights when they first came about. And I wonder if you've ever looked at the evolution of the core labor standards, which in theory are agreed to by workers, governments, and the private sector, and have they taken a different path in terms of applicability, in terms of their evolution, compared to a lot of the other rights dialogues?
Well, I'm less familiar with the ILO, but like the number of ILO instruments, my guess, if I had to guess, is that you would see a similar trend line. Right? The things I saw, ILO 169, I don't know what number they're up to. It's well beyond that now. So there's been a growth industry as well. And my guess is that for every France with its like kind of insane labor laws, we have countries, actually most of the countries I've worked in West Africa have the labor laws on the books that they exist for maybe 3% of the population that actually works in the formal sector. So that gap between the sort of ever-growing apparatus of labor law and people's actual working conditions, I would guess we would see the same gaps that we see for the growth of human rights.
It'd be interesting to look back before the end of World War II and see how they've evolved since then. The other thing is, and you mentioned West Africa, so harmful and exploitative forms of child labor. Well, West Africa is full of that because you have all these children working in the cocoa industry and other factors. You have national laws, but the reality at the local level is families economically feel pressure to have the children work. So that's sometimes also where some of the human rights are into a challenge, is that the human right is a middle class right and not necessarily something that's reality. The flip side is in 2001, when there was the 11-year anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Bush administration had come in, they were very leery of a couple of the rights about access to birth control. And I worked with a number of evangelical but not right-wing NGOs to point out to the Bush people that a lot of women under 18 were married. And you didn't want them to have 3 babies in 3 years. So they actually acceded, based on that argument, about not opposing access to family planning, birth control for girls under 18. So there's all those kind of subtleties you can get into with these rights. And I think that's one of the things where the culture, the norms become so important, is what's the hook on some of these rights to get people to begin to observe them or to see that they have value.
Yeah, I think that conversation in labor law between the gap between the labor laws and cultural congruence, right, is one that similar to human rights, is one that hasn't happened enough. If you look at the commitment to eradicating the worst forms of child labor, I can't remember the ILO number there, but then when you look at the advocacy people do, there's an element of comedy to it. All the anti-trafficking organizations would come in and they would sometimes, so that for a very long time, there's been seasonal migrant workers that come down from Mali to work the coffee and cocoa fields in Cote d'Ivoire. And they do that out of economic necessity, right, including younger children and teenagers. And so sometimes the NGOs will go and capture them because they say, well, you're being trafficked. And so they'll put them in a trafficking prevention house for a while, basically in jail. And then finally let them go. And then the Malian teenager will just turn straight back around to go south down to work the coffee and cocoa fields, because that's what his family needs to be able to eat for the season, right? And so some of those rules that make sense in the context of the United States or Sweden don't make sense in the context of Mali. Yes.
Just thank you for the presentation. And mine is just a clarification. Do you think that human rights is truly universal as it is being called, as universal human rights. Okay. And again, looking at it, how can local communities and grassroots organizations adopt human rights? For instance, the professor gave example of child labor, all right? And then we say it is universal human rights. And here in most countries, I think that my personal thing is that human rights framework is inherently Western because it doesn't apply in most countries, especially in West Africa, where I'm from. There is nothing like human rights. And then the Western world play along with it. And they are partners of it. In terms of kidnapping, in terms of organ harvesting, in terms of every form of criminality. Sorry to say that.
Also, there's two discussions one could have. One is, are human rights universal? And so that's a huge project in literature where people trace back antecedents of human rights within the Christian tradition, within the Islamic tradition. And you can actually find roots, right, in those in global cultures. Every culture around the world has rules about right, fair, and unjust treatment, right? So those sorts of ideas are universal. There are elements of it, especially in terms of the expression, that are very Western, right? They're the liberal ideology I've been talking about that gave expression to human rights is certainly one that has a longer pedigree in the Western world. One question, though, is does it matter? Does it matter if human rights are universal, right? I would think of rights as a tool for trying to alleviate human suffering. And so to the extent that in a given context, they actually help us manage human suffering and try to mitigate it over time, we don't care where television came from or where the number 0 came from or where any technology came from. The question is, do people like it and does it work, right? And so irrespective of the ideological origin of rights, to the extent that it is a tool for human emancipation, for human freedom, for alleviating human suffering in Nigeria or Burkina Faso or in Mauritania or wherever, then we should keep using that tool. To the extent that there are better tools that would alleviate more human suffering, create more human flourishing, then we should be looking at those tools as well. But I think in some ways the debate about is it really Western, is it not, becomes a bit of a distraction. The question is, in which country do people like being tortured? I haven't found one. Is torture an African value? Of course it's not, right? So, I've lived in West Africa for 5 years. I've had many of these conversations with people. Nobody wants to be tortured by their government. Nobody wants to be disappeared by their government for no reason. Nobody wants to be locked up in jail for 20 years with no trial, right? So even if we said, well, these are Western norms, does that mean Nigeria should torture people and lock them up for 20 years without trial? I mean, that would be absurd, right? So the question is, are they valuable? Do they help with human flourishing and do they alleviate suffering? And that's what this project is about, is actually tuning them so they actually do a better job at that. I think where West African organizations can actually do a good job was with a process that's called vernacularization, which is actually taking these treaties, which at some level sound very legal, they sound very Western, and finding ways to translate those into a local idiom that people can actually make sense of. So when you look at what's been done in India with many of the NGOs there's many people who are very skilled vernacularizers. So one of the things they've done is they do like street theater and puppets. And instead of coming in and saying, well, here's the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that wouldn't resonate with people. What they do is they use the Mahabharata, the longest epic, I think, in the world. Right? So they use these religious stories to actually talk about gender justice. So they're talking about human rights, but they're not doing it using the language of the UN, the language of the treaties. They're talking about it using local cultural expression. So that's vernacularization.
Yeah, but sometimes we want to experience it, see it functional in Africa. Okay, that's the biggest problem. For it to be functional,
Sure.
And then that determines who enforces it, who should enforce it, because most of these things we do the theory aspect of it, but when it comes to the pragmatic approach to it, it becomes a question. So that's the biggest problem of human rights. Well, that's why I'm asking whether it's really universal.
Well, so this project is about trying to narrow that gap between the law and the books and the law in action, and I think that's part of what you're lamenting. Everywhere in West Africa has signed all the treaties. They're all in all your constitutions, right? But there's a huge gap between that and people's lived reality. Questions? Yeah.
You kind of answered one of my previous questions, but you said vernacular treaties, right? What would that look like in the sense of, would it be changing compliance requirements or what compliance actually means, or changing the interpretation of the right specifically?
Well, I think So getting to where I would like to go, I mean, first of all, it would be curb the enthusiasm, the kind of Larry David moment, right? Stop it with like all the resolutions and new treaties, like, first of all, like stop adding. Then there's also this question of could less actually be more? Could we subtract, right? And so I don't think it has legs, but you know, I would like to see us go to a universal treaty on human rights that would simply be the legal expression of the Universal Declaration, which was just it's not a legally binding treaty. And that actually probably is the direction things would have gone after the Cold War if the Russians and the US had been able to agree with each other. We hadn't split the Universal Declaration into two components. So that would kind of get us back to a core. And it's particularly the later treaties that actually have these like incredibly elaborate kind of legislative provisions saying that I think the Convention on Persons with Disabilities that governments are required to keep disaggregated statistics, and it's very detailed. I think a lot of that stuff we can just actually let go of. A second question, I think, in which you're asking is this question of what wiggle room do countries actually have to implement these rights, right? And there might be some provisions where we actually want to insist on a pretty hard floor, like torture. You know, I hope that torture doesn't, like in one country, we can actually like shock people's testicles, and the other we can't. That would not be not good level of like variation between human rights standards, right? But we look at things like freedom of speech; those already vary quite a bit in the world. If you look at freedom of speech in Europe, in the United States, for example, we treat certain things very, very differently in terms of hate speech laws, for example. So we already have what in the European system would be called this concept of the margin of appreciation, which is this question of how much latitude do countries actually have to interpret, how much wiggle room do they have. What you actually find is that the European Court of Human Rights, effectively what it's doing is it looks at the level of consensus or dissensus within the member states. And if most of the countries are doing it, it is willing to impose that on the outlier states. If it looks at an issue and it's 50-50, it basically says, oh, that's within your margin of appreciation, meaning that's within your latitude, your political discretion to do this. So one can imagine something like an international margin of appreciation, where we would think about, you know, maybe what freedom of speech is. It already is different in Europe than it is here. Maybe it's also a little bit different in Africa or Latin America or Asia. But that would be one place to start in kind of thinking about that, where we already have human rights systems that have tried to work out some of these differences as between people's interpretive latitude between countries.
So there's a few questions online. Topher had his hand raised, if Topher, and then I can read you some from the chat.
Awesome. Okay. So I just want to like raise the standard for like all the tree huggers out there. So my question has something to do with, you know, the context in which human rights arose, this age of the nation state politically and the Enlightenment philosophically, both of which are sort of built in conversation, at least, with the large scale exploitation of the natural world. And I think that like human rights increasingly sort of proscribed or limited human predation of other humans, right? As we sort of turned our collective predatory projects outward toward the natural world. And as you know, Austin and I have this paper arguing that slavery declined in this country, at least due in part to the rise of the whaling industry. But whatever comes next, I think if human societies are to exist over the long haul, it has to be sustainable, right? Whatever that means. Restraining the ability of nation states to predate and erode the natural world and sort of push that sort of the boundary of that which is protected from predation, embracing the sort of larger view of who or what is to be considered sacrosanct, right? Which human rights have done for, you know, or at least try to do universally for all humans. So I'm wondering if your call for restraint for human rights might coexist as well with a call for extending rights to ecosystems, natural features, flora, fauna, fungi, perhaps. I don't know. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, you're going kind of beyond even where the conversation is about the right to a clean environment, or different ways of phrasing that, right? So in most of the international treaties, there's no right to a clean environment. There is, and I think the African Convention on Human and People's Rights. But most of the core treaties, there's no right to a healthy environment. There's been a big push starting with the Earth Day Conference, 1970, whatever it was, to actually articulate this as a right. If you look at, I think every national constitution that's been adopted post World War II has included some kind of right to clean environment. Some of those are justiciable and some are not. So there certainly seems to be a kind of push and move in that direction. It's never really gone anywhere at the UN in terms of actually trying to formalize this in terms of a human treaty. It's not wrong to think of some kind of right to a healthy environment as like a true survival right? This is not a right to be portrayed in a certain way on television, that the right I keep picking on, right? This is like, these are kind of go to, do we continue to exist as a species? So this is thinking about the rights of people to a healthy environment though, right? But I mean, so one possibility is the expansionist trend just continues to take place at a national level, consistent with what we've seen for most post-war constitutions. Another possibility is suppose you actually did have a conference and we said we're going to scrap the 9 treaties and we're going to negotiate a universal treaty and we're going to try to whittle it down to 50 articles. Maybe one of those is a right to a healthy environment, right? If we're talking about a real core minimum of true survival rights, I'm certainly open to the idea. I think I've written as such that should be considered, right, as among the core. When I wrote a paper about 3rd generation rights years ago. I mean, where you're trying to extend it is taking it into a different space, though, right, in terms of like the rights of ecosystem themselves and sentient but non-human beings. And that's, yeah, I mean, that's kind of Peter Singer's territory, right? Did I do a good job at not answering your question?
No, that's wonderful. Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Well, I think like maybe I'm just gonna re-ask Topher's question, but I feel like this is a fun, this would be like the Kroc fight, like, this big debate, because Topher and I are like trying to expand, and you were saying we can't help but contract, right? I don't know if I'm sorry to this at the beginning of the talk, but I'm not sure if you're making Hopgood's argument or not, or extending it, but so I think where Topher and I are trying to push things is to like just extend beyond this platform, like the human platform. And so I guess what I'd love to hear, and I'm really happy if it's antagonistic, because then we can actually like, sell tickets to the fight. But what do you think of that? Is that like is that something is that like for never, or is that maybe for later? And where would that fit in the approach that you're taking?
I think that's an interesting question for cultures, and like, what are we indignant about? What actually like creates like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened, right? And I think that says a lot about us as a culture. If you look at photos of like mass bodies or something and the indignation that can arise, and that was one of the kind of motivating, catalyzing features after World War II that led to things like the UDHR. I remember years ago reading an article about insect biomass dying off and the number of bees declining. I was thinking one can imagine a completely different culture that valued the environment much more, where that would have been the worst article you ever read. That would have been the front page of the New York Times instead of like a footnote to a footnote somewhere that nobody actually thought about, right? But I mean, that also suggests, like, to the extent that, if you want to expand rights in that direction, it's going to be meaningful. Part of what needs to happen is an evolution of culture and popular sentiment, right? It needs to be a more sort of democratic, like the law and the courts and everything else can only get so far out of where people are in terms of what they actually support democratically, or you risk backlash, or you risk the credibility gap problem, where what's on paper and what's happening in reality are so far. And I guess my question would be, like, have we seen enough evolution in popular sentiment to imagine those laws actually passing in a few countries, much less like a universal rights in this regard? And I probably answered my own question, but I don't think we're there. Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Frank.
I can ask a follow-up. So it seems like your perception is that these international bodies should be really focusing on rights that kind of everyone can agree to. It seems like what Topher and Austin are suggesting is like there should also be space for kind of rights entrepreneurs who are kind of thinking about where rights should go. Are you maybe suggesting that these should be kind of 2 separate projects, that there's like a space for enumerating and protecting the rights that we maybe are not universal, but that like we agree to some extent, and then maybe a separate space for rights entrepreneurs who are trying to think about rights like how you're portrayed on television, or rights for environmental beings?
So it's interesting if you go back and look at the writings from like Eleanor Roosevelt and other architects of UDHR. Everybody anticipated that rights expansion is what happened. There would be claims and demands for new rights. There's also been for a long time, you can go back and find Philip Alston writing, I think by 1980 or 81, talking about the need for quality control. At the time, I think it was like somebody was trying to promote a right to tourism. I think that was like the tourism board, right? But one of these questions is, why does every good or desirable thing have to be articulated as a right? There are many policies I would support that aren't necessarily a fundamental human right. And again, it goes to that tension between rights and democracy. But the whole purpose of rights was to take things out of the majority's hands. So if we say there's a right to tourism, that means I guess there's an obligation to fund it, and somehow it's no longer within our policy discretion to decide not to fund people's right to tourism, right? And I know that's like a particularly silly example, but it wasn't. I think it was a real proposal, right? And so a little bit more of that thinking needs to happen, a little more of that quality control needs to happen in terms of kind of thinking, is this like a useful, desirable thing, or is this really like a fundamental thing that like is a survival right for human beings, that we have trans-civilizational consensus on the importance of this thing, in which case like right to tourism probably falls out, right to be portrayed in a particular light on television probably falls out. Many of the things in the treaties would fall out. Although I tried to avoid in the paper picking on certain rights or certain conventions, because that leads to, oh, you don't care about, disabled people or LGBT people or whatever it is. The kind of thrust of the paper is the kind of like we need to have a sober reckoning with like, what are we doing here? Like if we keep inflating things and we keep increasing this gap, how is that actually helping things, right? Just because it's a good idea. So the first like stop the madness before getting to like actually what would that process look like of actually deciding which we have 50 core rights, what are they, right? And that's where it gets really difficult. And it suggested Universal Declaration just because that's the easiest thing, but there's fair points that like Universal Declaration didn't include things like right to a clean environment, many other rights. Certainly not all I don't think humanity arrived at the apogee of its wisdom in 1948 either, right? So there has been some evolution in like moral and public sentiment since then, and there needs to be some space to accommodate that. But for the 70 or 80 years since the UDHR, we've had nothing but space for rights inflation and for this project. I mean, you saw it in all of the graphs, and if all of those graphs actually corresponded with an increase in rights protection for all those things, I would say, great, let's actually keep adding rights and keep adding treaties, because clearly the magic is working. But it's contested whether the treaties make any difference at all. So, I mean, if you go back to Una Hathaway's work from around 2002, as a legal scholar at Yale, she went and coded the amnesty treaties and the State Department reports and said, actually, sometimes things get worse after ratification. That seems like a bit of a puzzle. Maybe they're getting like a reputational halo for doing it. People kind of lay off, and then they actually torture even more, right? So that looked like, wow, that's not good news for human rights, but it seemed like that's what the data was. Chris Ferris and Beth Simmons and other people have come in later and said, actually, if you use statistical methods that are Topher would understand, but are like totally over my head. If you use more sophisticated methods, that what she's saying is not true. Because if you actually just went and coded the amnesty reports from 1970s onwards, you're going to miscode them. Because the way they were using something like a disappearance or extrajudicial execution in the late 70s is not the same as it was used today. We actually apply it to many more things. Whereas back then it meant something like an assassination. Now it's applied to like any police killing. So if you just code them in a straightforward way without changing the concept creep, it can make it look like even when things got better, they actually got worse. But even the people that have said it's not as bad as Hathaway says have said that the improvements are maybe meaningful but quite modest. And I would hazard a guess that they're probably even more modest for some of those fancier rights that I've been mentioning. Oh yeah, May.
Just jumping in on the discussion before, which is really interesting. I think one thing that you said that really helped me was thinking of human rights and these treaties as a tool. So then I think one question is, what are the other tools available? So not every good that we would want to see appear in a society is achievable through this tool.
Right.
And it's not even necessarily the most fundamental or important things that we would put in that bucket. Like there's actually something about, so if you think about like individual human behavior, like what are the parts of our individual human behavior that are constrained by laws, right? Versus all the other things, education, socialization, norms, pressure, choice architecture, like information, all of that stuff. So then certain types of choices and decisions and behaviors and that's where legal expertise would come in, are able to be constrained, are amenable to being constrained by law. And probably similarly in human rights, there are some things that are, and I don't know, maybe environment is one of them, maybe it's not, but we have to figure out what are the criteria. So you have. insights into that question.
One thing that I was thinking about when you were talking is like there's many different kind of discourses and vocabularies of social change, of emancipation, human betterment, and human rights is one of those. In some contexts, it might be the one that gets traction. In other contexts, it might not be, right? So in certain times and places, discourses of solidarity would have actually had the most meaning, and human rights don't really get us to the solidarity. That's trying to achieve something much deeper, right, than human rights. In certain times and places, a discourse of looking at the hadith of the Prophet and the Hanbali and Hanafi and different schools of like Islamic legal interpretation would actually be much more persuasive and get you far more traction, right? And so in that context, going in and using human rights talk would be fairly counterproductive. But we don't actually see, I mean, that in the vernacularization, there's also this ability to code switch between vocabularies and using the right tool. Critical legal studies people hate that word tool because it suggests there's not an ideology. There obviously is an ideology in human rights, but so with that caveat, using the right tool for the job. So sometimes that might be human rights talk, sometimes it might be Sharia talk. But when you look at the stance of most human rights groups, they won't do that. So like famously, a friend from law school, Nazma Derzadeh, wrote an article, I think it was called Who's Afraid of Sharia Law? And she was making the point that in Human Rights Watch papers, they always say, we're taking no position when it comes to Sharia law. All we're doing is talking about human rights. Part of the reason they're doing that is they don't want to acknowledge there's actually huge tensions between the two. But her point was that actually in certain times, you might actually be better writing a paper about gender rights in Saudi Arabia and finding progressive Sharia law scholars and articulating it in a discourse that would actually be culturally resonant. That might actually get you further, right? Thinking about that. Even I remember when I did a report on sexual violence in Cote d'Ivoire during the civil war there, and we then reached out to some non-traditional advocacy targets. We met the National Council of Priests and Imams, in addition to ministers of justice and security and everything else. And it was so interesting to hear the imams and the priests hear what we were saying and reprocess it and then express it using religious imagery or metaphor. And you just immediately realize that, like, imagine stupid old me, like going and speaking to their congregation, how dumb I would sound as compared to how they could actually translate this into a cultural idiom as vernacularizers. It makes sense. So, I mean, part of it is the project of what legally counts, but part of it actually is the project of, you were saying, like, there's other things we care about. We care about love, we care about solidarity. Not all things we care about can be captured by human rights. Part of that might be just getting better at code switching and using the right tool or the right idiom for the actual context we're working in, instead of, you know, just coming in with the right stuff. Are we have time for more questions?
Yeah, there's a few online. So Franco with some Keele University International Relations students have some questions. One, I'll just go in order. Does reducing rights to a minimum not allow some actors to claim to be restoring full rights during an intervention?
I don't understand the part about restoring full rights during an intervention, but I mean, I would imagine you would still have what are considered derogable and non-derogable rights. It's hard words to say. Right. So in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, for example, there are certain rights that can be suspended. Even under Lincoln, famously suspended the right of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Right. So most of the treaties make allowance for national emergencies, and maybe in a time of national emergency, you could curtail freedom of speech more than in peacetime. The treaties also say that there are certain rights that are non-derogable. You can't say because we're in war, I get to torture people, or because we're in war, I get to shoot civilians in the head, because war, I get to commit sexual violence, right? Those rights are on the short list of ones you can never, even during an emergency, you have to hold to. So I would think even in my fantasy world where we actually had just one treaty, we would still have some distinction between derogable and non-derogable rights, which would then, in theory, not allow countries to use a crisis as an excuse to curtail rights. But I don't know if that's the actual question. I was a little bit confused by the wording.
Sure, Franco, you heard that. If you want to clarify, go ahead to another one, which is, do you anticipate the process of localizing liberalism would be more prone to causing war or peace in the short term and in the long term?
More prone than what, I guess, would be one question. I don't know if the assumption is that neoliberalism has caused war because we had no wars before neoliberalism. Actually, the spread of liberalism has been associated with the great peace and one of the most peaceful times in human history. I think a lot of that probably has to do with the nuclear bomb, why we haven't seen at least great power conflict since the end of World War II. But I know Amy Chua, a scholar at Yale, has made the argument that, and actually Roland Paris and others made, so one argument that was made back in the early '80s was that rapid liberalization, where you rapidly have elections, you rapidly liberalize economic markets, that might be destabilizing. It might even promote conflict because you have societies that have never had freedom of speech, that have never had elections. And now if you actually rush to elections and have freedom of speech, that you unleash the forces of ethnic conflict and competition that maybe had been like stifled under the authoritarian rule before. I mean, there's a certain element of truth to that. But I think that the response to that institutionally and also in the critical studies literature has been, yes, you're right, that rapid liberalization might promote conflict or instability. That doesn't mean that gradual liberalization is necessarily a bad thing. So I don't want to get into it, but there was a whole shift in peace building to, we'll do institutionalization before liberalization. So we'll do some institution strengthening before we then move on to elections. Ultimately, the international community wants the elections because we want to get out, and that's the only exit strategy that we have. So there's probably always going to be a push to elections. Anyway, again, I don't know if I've actually answered the question.
So far, yes. And then there's another one. Claire, I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks, Professor Sharp. This was great. It's great to hear you talk again. I tend not to be too sympathetic to the kind of world polity, global culture argument, so I really appreciated your added nuance. I do have a question, though, about your treatment of global hegemonic capitalism and exploitation in your model. Corporations and foreign governments are involved in these human rights debates, not only the constituents and the governments or like regional bodies, even international legal bodies, right? So, for example, earlier you gave the example that there's countries where only 3% of the population enjoy the labor rights promised by their government's ratification of international treaties. And I just have to imagine that in many of these contexts that have not realized this broad affordance of human rights, oftentimes foreign, but sometimes also domestic corporations, at least to some extent, are central actors in maintaining this exploitation and kind of like this global capitalist hegemony that's being enacted on a local level. So I'm wondering where these predatory foreign governments or corporations and profit seekers are accounted for in your model of local liberalism.
I guess the point I was making in the paper was to actually try to distinguish liberalism from neoliberalism and to point out there's many variants of the liberal tradition. There are liberalisms and alternative liberalisms. And so when you look at a lot of the critique of liberalism, it seems it's almost a straw man where they set up this kind of caricature of liberalism that's always based on hyper capital, bare knuckle, predatory capitalism, as if liberalism and that form of capitalism were synonymous. But I think the reality is Sweden is a very capitalist society, right? And yet that's the dream society for many of my students over the years, right? And that's one variant of liberal tradition, the same way that, Ayn Rand and the kind of libertarian, all we need is like kind of small government, a night watchman state, or capitalism during the 19th century in the UK, or the kind of liberal American tradition, Anglo tradition. Those are all liberalism, right? And so even within the liberal tradition, you can actually go back to these debates in the late 19th century between Thomas Hale Green and others, where they were saying we should promote not just negative liberty, meaning like the right not to be tortured, but positive liberty, by which they meant a society that actually had a safety net, that actually did regulate corporations, that provided social services, right? So even within the liberal tradition, there's debates about, right, how do we regulate capitalism? What kind of capitalism? What should the safety net look like? How much of a safety net should we have? And so when people set up a straw man, say that the problem is liberalism, again, my argument in the paper is you're confusing liberalism, the broader tradition, with this very narrow variant, which I don't like either, right? Certainly the paper is not a defense of hyper neoliberal, bare-knuckled, aggressive capitalism. Pretty much all my writing over the last 20 years is the kind of opposite of what I've supported in terms of economic justice and economic rights. So the second point I'm making is that the alternatives to liberalism have not done awesome, right? And so people, well, communism has never been tried, well, except for like the 26 or 28 times that it has. And every single time it's turned into basically Venezuela. So if there's a better model, according to John Lennon here, we'd love to see the plan. So what I was making in the paper was a defense of elements of liberal tradition without defending neoliberalism.
We're next time if you have any closing remarks.
No, thank you very much for coming. I really